With the G7 summit looming in a few weeks, sources say Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump are in direct discussions to reach a trade deal and lift tariffs. The federal government, however, is being tight-lipped about the details of those talks.
How close are you to a deal?
We're not talking about that publicly.
Trump and Carney are talking. Are you any closer to reaching a deal? How would you describe those discussions?
Guys, do you really think I'll answer that question? No, but I won't answer that question. We won't negotiate in public.
Meanwhile, at Queen's Park, there seems to be optimism that deal is close to being finalized.
Well, I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Prime Minister. I just know that they're right at the brink. They're working hard around the clock to try to get a deal.
I'm joined now by Radio Canada's Parliamentary Bureau Chief, Louis Blouin. Louis, let's talk about Canada-U.S. trade. And this idea of getting something done by the G7 middle of June in Canada-U.S. Where do things stand on that?
What my source is telling me is that they see a window for Canada to be able to get an agreement before the summit. They see a way to push a negotiation. They have a goalpost, and they really want to try and do this big effort before the summer to be able to get some deal done. So there's very intensive discussions that we hear about, and now we know that Donald Trump and Mark Carney are talking directly. They've been talking a few times.
And texting in the evening.
Texting in the evening. So I guess that's a good sign. You know, if the contact is still there, if, you know, the electricity still goes through between the two. But we'll see. And like at the beginning of the week, I was told, you know, I feel it's 50-50 for with Donald Trump in that particular window. So I think it's very uncertain. I don't know how the steel and aluminum tariffs just pour in the mix this week. Did that, you know, sour things or not? But they see this window. But I'm told that if it doesn't work before the summit, then they're looking at a long-range game that could lead us to the revision of the free trade deal between the two countries. So the strategy might change there. And you know that Mark Carney is talking about this Rearm Europe deal. He's talking a bit about it. He might sign the deal at the end of the month of June. I see as that a part of a chip of negotiation with Donald Trump. We'll see if it has any result in the short.
Yeah, 75 cents of every dollar they spend on defense equipment goes to the U.S. Maybe they suddenly becomes 40 cents of every dollar and the rest goes to Europe. Who knows? But just on the G7, so my conversations, just to make sure, let's compare notes on this, is that it wasn't necessarily they set that as a deadline to get a deal. It's just that was the next time they knew Donald Trump and Mark Carney would be together and try to get as much as they could get done by then. There's some discussion maybe of a UK-style term sheet as a possibility by then if they don't get the full agreement. And we're just talking about on the sectoral tariffs and defense integration. Does that align with what you're hearing?
Yes, and it doesn't mean that all tariffs would go away necessarily. Could be a part of it, could be some of them, but at least get a beginning of something here because tariffs are hurting this side of the border, the other side of the border. So there's hope and there is discussion. The fact is that there is serious discussions happening. Dominique Leblanc was there this week. He met with Secretary of Commerce Lutnick. So there's things happening. So I think this goalpost is probably shared in a way with the Americans. At least they're studying maybe what they could do there. Because the more and more they will get closer to the next, the midterms election in the U.S., pressure is going to build on Donald Trump. His popularity is going down. You know, the American economy is slowing down too. So there's also the government here feels that the more they go forward, it could help them. So if they miss this window, I guess if they play the long game, which could be damaging, there could be some people losing their jobs in Canada, but they feel that they could also have a strategy in the long term, and then maybe we could see some more retaliatory tariffs. So we'll see. That would be interesting.
Right, because the G7 is set for June 15th, 16th, 17th, you know, in Canada-U.S. in Alberta. You know, the economic projections are that the tariff blowback inside the U.S., you're really going to see that in July, August, September. So if it's not done by then, that's when you'll see the pain in the U.S. economy that Trump cannot blame on Joe Biden, that he will bear responsibility for. But given the ongoing texting and talking between the Prime Minister and the President, this explains the sort of cautious response to the steel tariffs coming into force and the aluminum tariffs coming into force. So Mark Carney
Everybody's
said it's
very
sensitive.
cautious. And I did an interview yesterday with a CEO from the aluminum industry. He told me that the signs he got are pretty positive. We heard that a bit this week from Doug Ford. I was 50-50 with my source. So we'll see where it lands. But there's hope, of course, even in industry leaders of the aluminum in the United States. People are saying this is nonsense because Canada exports almost all his aluminum to the U.S. They need Canadian aluminum. So everybody's kind of hoping that, the logical argument will prevail. We will
so
see.
far.
But you're right to say that they are very cautious. And even Mélanie Joly today said, we will not negotiate in public.
Dom LeBlanc said the same thing going into the House of Commons.
Everybody's being extra careful, so something is happening. And it's interesting to know that it is Mark Carney himself speaking with Donald Trump. Remember the day where he shuffled his cabinet a few weeks ago? He was asked the question, why is Mélanie Joly not the right interlocutor for the future? He said, wait. I'm the interlocutor. There's one. It's me. I'm the negotiator in this. So he is deeply involved himself, one-on-one with Donald Trump. He's probably calculating that it is the way to strike a deal with Donald Trump. And this week, the U.S. ambassador said during an event in Toronto that when Donald Trump gets involved, it could happen quickly. Or maybe not. We'll see, David. I mean, at the end of the day, he just turned away some agreements that he himself signed. So even if we strike a deal next week...
Does it even hold, right? Like the trade deal he negotiated during his first presidency is the one he is violating with this. But just as a final point, Louis, Danielle Smith was in Washington, D.C., and she said to the Canadian press, it's encouraging to hear there might be some sort of a détente or something on tariffs by the G7. Doug Ford, 2 days in a row, has said they're close to a deal, said today they're on the brink of a deal. I don't know if the federal government likes that. I'd heard when we were both in Saskatoon, there were some signals of optimism of maybe getting something, but does it feel like it's on the cusp or it's on the brink or that it's moving in a positive direction, but then steel and aluminum kind of knocked it back a little bit?
Just discussions happening could be that positive sign that they feel. It doesn't mean there's going to be a deal and all the details of a deal also next week. If there could be kind of agreement in principle or something. So we don't really know where it's going. But I'm sure knowing the style of Mark Carney, that he would surely prefer that nobody talks about this right now, that he would deal with it.
One messenger, one message.
One message in the shadow, no speculation. I'm sure he wants to keep it as low as possible. So that's why today probably Mélanie Joly also was asked about it, was very firm about it. I will not take that question, guys. She's like, I'm not going there. So maybe that's the stakes are high. They want to have this win before the G7. Politically, it would be great for them if they could get it before.
He's the change agent, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. But Pete Hoekstra, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, said in the Globe and Mail today, leaks don't help this, as he told the Globe and Mail about the private conversations between the president and the prime minister. So here we are. All right, Louis, always appreciate it. This is Louis Blouin, Radio Canada's parliamentary bureau chief. Thanks, man.
Thank you, David.
Well, Canadian steelworkers are bracing for impact after the U.S. doubled tariffs on steel and aluminum yesterday. Now at 50%, the tariff is putting thousands of jobs at risk, largely in places like Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie. The Canadian steel industry is pushing the federal government to retaliate, and Industry Minister Mélanie Joly says talks are happening at the highest level.
We're in solution mode. Our goal is to make sure that we are there to support the sector at the same time where we know we have to have a stronger domestic sector.
The mayor of Sault Ste. Marie, Matthew Shoemaker, joins me now. Mayor Shoemaker, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Algoma is a big employer in your town. About how many jobs have these tariffs cost so far?
Well, the 25% tariffs have caused about 20 to 30 jobs locally, with the threat of another 40 or 50 coming imminently. And if these are in place for any length of time whatsoever, the threat becomes exponentially worse.
Well, Algoma Steel CEO Michael Garcia said tariffs at a rate of 50% could make the company's U.S. business unviable. What would that mean for Sault Ste. Marie?
Yeah, it's an economic reality that no one in the community has really ever seen. The steel plant's been around for 120 plus years, and it is a threat that would, it would remake the community and make it essentially a post-industrial community. I mean, we talk about the mills around Pittsburgh that have shut down, exactly the type of community that Donald Trump is now trying to bring back from the dead. Well, in our opinion, my opinion, it's easier to support the industry that you have than it is to try and, bring it back to life after it's gone. So I think that is the critical need for the federal and provincial government to support Algoma now to make sure that it is there if a deal is struck on tariffs.
A post-industrial community, I mean, that's a stark image you're painting there. I mean, have you got a sense of when the tipping point is? You know what I mean? Because you can ride it out, and I'm not trying to minimize the job losses by any circumstances, but there becomes a point where you can't come back, right? I mean, what's your sense of how long this can be endured?
Yeah, well, the majority of Algoma's steel ends up in the U.S. So with the president, the CEO Michael Garcia saying that it makes it unviable, that means the majority of steel sales are going to evaporate from the Algoma Steel's balance sheet. So you can do the math for yourself. If you lose 50% of your customers overnight, it's not going to be a very long time if you don't have something to replace it. And this is really the message that we've been giving to the federal government, pushing with our federal and provincial counterparts, that we could probably sustain a couple of weeks if there is a deal to be had. But if there is not, there is going to have to be an immediate backstop for the steel plant and its workers in the Sault, in Hamilton, in Regina, and the aluminum mills in Quebec, because it is unsustainable at 50% tariff.
Well, what would that look like, Mayor Shoemaker? I mean, we're talking not a COVID scale, but a COVID style, like a wage subsidy, credit facilities. I mean, what sort of ideas are you imagining there?
Well, I think it's probably a combination of all those things, as well as, there are things that have been talked about and promised, like defense procurement, which is great, but it needs to be immediate defense procurement. This can't be orders 6 months from now. It's got to be orders that happen immediately if there is no deal to be had. Like I said, in the next couple of weeks, I mean, Algoma's got a stockpile of steel that it can sell currently that's been produced over the last couple of weeks and months. But once, the order sheet dries up, which as of the 50% tariff, that clock begins ticking. You need something to keep those lines open, to keep those shifts going. Otherwise, it's going to bring things to a screeching halt rather quickly.
Have you gotten any indication of how rapidly the federal government may be able to move? Because I know they have said they want to prioritize Canadian steel and lumber and aluminum and everything and all the building and the projects and the procurement they want to do. But I don't know if that's going to come in the time frame that Algoma and the Sault might need. You know what I mean? So what have you heard from the feds?
Yeah, unfortunately, not enough. We haven't heard. What gave me some concern yesterday was that the Prime Minister said they will take some time before responding to the 50% increase in tariffs, and we're seeing some hint today that might mean they're close to a deal on a wide spectrum of tariff relief. But as I'm saying, there needs to be a plan B ready to go, that if they can't strike that deal by the G7, there needs to be a plan B in place for countermeasures on tariffs, for supports for workers, and for orders for the steel plant to put into effect right away. So my hope is that while some of the government apparatus is busy negotiating the deal, there is another aspect of the government apparatus that is planning out what happens if a deal is not reached. Right.
And on that point, I took the Prime Minister's comments yesterday to mean take some time to contemplate retaliation, not necessarily supports. So I don't know if you parse it the same way, but it's possible for them to support workers without retaliating against the United States. Have you heard anything about that? Because this has been one of the deficiencies people have pointed to about EI changes or wage subsidies or something to directly go to workers, that it's not there yet. Have you heard anything at all on that?
Not since the campaign, frankly. We were talking to a number of ministers who came through and were campaigning throughout the election campaign. The Prime Minister himself came to Algoma and spoke of the supporting workers. And when Premier Ford was in the Sault during the election campaign, certainly spoke about responding to the tariff impacts in these communities, but we haven't had sufficient details, in my opinion. I will, give credit where credit is due, get a call from Premier Ford this morning saying that they are working on this Algoma file around the clock. So I know that, it's top of mind for the provincial cabinet and for the Treasury Board. And I trust and hope that it is for the federal government. I understand that, they're being rather tight-lipped about things today. I've got a meeting with my federal counterpart, my provincial counterpart, and Algoma Steel tomorrow, where I'm hoping that there is more light shed on the situation.
Well, look, steel companies, unions, the Steel Producers Association, they're all up on Parliament Hill today. They're in meetings right now, as I understand it, with senior officials and cabinet ministers in the government. We're hoping to hear from some of them in the second hour of the show. They're pushing for quick retaliation. Doug Ford said, go now so we don't get steamrolled. What do you hope to hear coming out of this meeting later in this show?
Yeah, I hope there's a plan for retaliation, even if that plan is a backup plan to a negotiated agreement. So what worked in, what worked in 2017 and 18 was when the retaliatory tariffs were really ramped up on swing districts in Republican areas. That seemed to move the needle. Now, times are different this time around. You've got a Congress that is certainly more devout to the president than it was in 2017 and 18. But still, I think that the retaliatory measures should be planned out for in the event the negotiated settlement can't be reached. And at the same time, that supports for workers are put in place to come into effect immediately for anyone whose job is lost or is laid off as a result of these tariffs.
Matthew Shoemaker, the Mayor of Sault Ste. Marie, we appreciate your time, sir, and good luck to you and the people in the Soo. Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much.
Well, I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Prime Minister. I just know that they're right at the brink. They're working hard around the clock to try to get a deal.
For a second straight day, Ontario Premier Doug Ford sounds optimistic that Canada and the United States are close to a trade deal, but the people in those negotiations, well, they're staying tight-lipped.
How close are you to the deal?
We're not talking about that publicly.
Trump and Carney are talking. Are you any closer to reaching a deal? How would you describe those discussions?
Guys, do you really think I'll answer that question? No, but I won't answer that question. We won't negotiate in public.
Now, we did learn today that Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump are and have been speaking directly. Sources say they've spoken on the phone a few times and exchanged some text messages. The hope is to get some sort of agreement reached by the G7 summit, which is about 10 days from now in Alberta. We're going to start there with the power panel. Jonathan Kalis was a Quebec advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. And Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Good to see you all. James, I want to tap into your NAFTA Council experience if I can. I mean, it's not shocking to learn that Mark Carney and Donald Trump are in direct contact when stakes are like this, and the two men are the types of leaders they are, not a comparison, but separate and distinct definitions. What do you make of this notion that the G7 is sort of the aspiration? Is that just because it's the next time they're guaranteed to be in the room, or do you think that's actually enough runway to get this done?
I do think that President Trump recognizes a little bit of the box that he finds himself in, right? He promised 90 deals in 90 days. That hasn't happened. The only thing that's ever been sort of materialized is basically an offer sheet between the United States and the United Kingdom that, is for a few specific things, including some procurement measures for aircraft. But other than that, not a lot has been realized. Meanwhile, President Trump has his challenges in the United States with his big, beautiful tax bill and some challenges on the right flank of the Republican caucus, Marjorie Taylor Greene being critical of the administration today, the Elon Musk, public feud that's happening today. So there's a lot going on there. And I do think that President Trump aspires to have something meaningful and positive to say. Whether or not it's actually a substantive agreement or a substantive arrangement, it's hard to know. But I do think that there are sort of anecdotal signs of progress and progress, in process that I think he would like to be able to hang his hat on to sort of demonstrate to Americans that he's getting things done while there seems to be a lot of drama around the administration. So I think the Prime Minister is being smart. His ministers are being very smart by not speculating about this publicly and not taking the bait of sort of daily asks about what's going on and what's not going on, because it's an administration that is frankly surrounded by drama and instability. And the best thing the government can do is to be stable, staid, make no public comments that can get inflamed in the American media market, and to recognize that there's a president here that does want to have some symbolic victories. We just need to sort of sort out what those are and whether or not they'll be accretive to Canada.
Well, James, this is a quick follow-up, and that was suggested to me today that maybe the whole thing doesn't get resolved but by the G7, but you could see a UK-style sheet that maybe at least gets some tariffs down and outlines the broad direction as at least some sort of a start. I mean, what do you make of that notion? Do you think that could get you there?
Conceivably. I mean, don't forget, there are basically three windows of tariffs that are imposed on us, right? And in particular, and this is why you see Premier Ford being so exercised as he is, because the province of Ontario is uniquely exposed to this because of the 232 tariffs. And the auto sector is the one sector that the President of the United States has been explicit about wanting to repatriate into the United States, the full assembly capacity in bringing it back into the United States. And if you look at some of the vehicles that are made in Canada, there are sort of sister lines of assembly that are already being, they think about the Silverado that's being made in Ontario. Well, there are Silverado assembly lines that are in the United States. It could be conceivable that could be just repatriated to the United States. And I think that Mr. Lutnick, the president, and others want to see those kind of industries brought into the United States. Then you add steel and aluminum. And I think there's some real vulnerabilities for the province of Ontario.
So John, I wonder what you make of this. The tight-lipped nature of Dominic LeBlanc and Melanie Joly was disciplined and a bit amusing today. But Doug Ford, 2 days in a row, keeps saying, oh, they're on the cusp, we're on the brink, it's moving. I mean, what are we to make of that?
Well, the Doug Ford style response is consistent since Trump's taken over, and his desire, whether it was Trudeau still in office or with Carney, to push back hard and to be very aggressive. The real change that I'm noticing, and I think you used the term a few weeks back about Mark Carney's communication style being economical. You're now seeing that with some of his ministers, especially ministers like Joly or LeBlanc, who usually have a lot to say, had very little to say, and they were explicit about how little they had to say. So that's a marked difference. Clearly, that's the order coming down from the top. I think that kind of discipline is warranted. I mean, it's smart. Why provoke? Why negotiate in public? I know some people have been saying, we want to know what's going on. I have no qualms, no issues with the media reporting on secret or private conversations. That's their job. But I don't think anybody really should expect that these types of discussions will be public. So what the end game is in the short term is hopefully maybe some of these tariffs, the doubling of the steel and aluminum tariffs, some of the others maybe being reduced, maybe the bill that's come in on, the border security and other things, maybe that'll help reduce the fentanyl tariffs. Maybe there can be a few sort of short-term deals with a plan on defense spending, all of that being combined together, that can eventually lead to a short-term deal leading to lessening of, the tension level, and then we can get to the bigger things, the longer-term things in Kuzma.
Andrew, what are your thoughts on what's happening or not happening based on what we're hearing and not hearing?
I mean, clearly both President Trump and Prime Minister Carney have achieved a certain degree of what they wanted to do politically. Certainly with the trade data that we're seeing coming out today, showing that especially in the auto sector, there is quite a hit being taken as a result of the trade measures from Trump. I mean, he's obviously sent a signal to American manufacturers that new investment is going to have to be south of the border if they're going to look for that to be successful. At the same time, I think Prime Minister Carney has been very successful in kind of resetting what the end game looks like for Canada. It will be about a decoupling from American interests. It will be about looking abroad. It will be about building domestic capacity. And I think he has built into the minds of the Canadian business community and public, that this is, we are in a time of fundamental change in terms of our economy. So in that regard, a lot of the big picture political pieces have been accomplished by both sides. The question now is, do the tariffs serve much other purpose beyond that, or have they, in fact, are they in a position where they can start to roll back? Both James and John will make the point that this is going to take a long time. A lot of this isn't going to get resolved until Kuzma's reopened, and even then, it's unlikely to be resolved. But I think a lot of the big pieces that were at risk there, things like the access to the Great Lake waters, a lot of these other pieces that Trump was testing, are kind of off the table. And so we're back into a more normal frame, but it is going to be one where I think both parties have signaled and to a certain extent achieved, at least at this stage, what they need to do politically.
Shachi, is a question of getting to the deal, but managing the expectations, you know, that the change agent, new prime minister, the guy who understands business, it's not really a deadline, but it's kind of hanging out there as a deadline now, based on the last couple of days and the comments by the Premier of Ontario that the G7 is a key milestone here now.
Yeah, and I mean, Canadians are prepared to and are giving Mark Carney, I think, quite a bit of a time and a wide berth in order to achieve the things that he set out and campaigned on doing and outlined in terms of the priorities in his throne speech. And we've got data out today that speaks to that level of confidence and his ability to better the relationship with the United States, get the economy turned around. You know, depending on the issue, whether it's reducing internal trade barriers, interprovincial trade barriers, yeah, there's a high level of confidence on that one. Dealing with Trump, I mean, it's a giant shrug emoji every single day. How can any of us know what the end game looks like for Trump when Trump is the perpetual shoelace that comes unstuck? You can glue it, you can triple knot it, you can duct tape it, and I think it's actually very canny for the Prime Minister to be texting Trump, to be phoning him, and in essence being the last voice in his ear as often as he can be, because we know that is what Trump listens to and responds to, and often, you know, that's the thing that can redirect a situation. So it's not a bad thing for Carney to be having those conversations, whether it happens by the G7 or whether it happens after that. I think the broader issue here is what does it look like and what does it mean in terms of whatever economic statement or budget or whatever we're going to see, particularly as we go into September. The calculations right now around how much support the auto sector is going to need, how much support the manufacturing sector is going to need. You know, I think, yes, the idea of having the, hey, we got a deal moment in Kananaskis is all fine and good, but you know, the really substantive issue here is how much needs to be put aside to help these industries through what it is inevitably that they're going to be facing, whether it's the concept of a plan of a deal, a la the UK, or whether it's something more, you know, more real. Right. But ultimately, it's the money piece that I think workers themselves, Canadians, and the Prime Minister, you know, must be focused and dialed into.
Okay, well, we got some new data today from Stats Canada that shows just how much of a toll the tariffs are taking on the Canadian economy. New numbers show Canadian exports have plunged, as Canada's trade deficit is now a record $7.1 billion, meaning Canada is bringing in far more than it's putting out to the world. And this led to some criticism from the Conservatives today, who say the Liberal government isn't responding strongly enough to the tariffs.
Facing enormous business and job losses, the very Prime Minister who promised to be elbows up is now allowing trade at the new Gordie Howe Bridge to collapse.
So, James, on that, you know, we've seen the retaliation calls for responding to the 50% on steel and aluminum, with Mark Carney saying they're going to take some time because conversations are at this delicate stage. But there is a constituency in the country, you know, the steel industry in particular and the aluminum sector, who want to see them hit back. I mean, how do you calibrate that when you're the negotiator, the interlocutor, and, you know, facing this kind of political pressure?
You move slowly and deliberatively, and you don't rush into things. We are, as of this moment, about 1/8 of the way through the second Trump presidency. We have 7/8 left. And the reality is, if through the second and third of those eighths you think that you're done with the challenges of the Trump administration, I think you're playing a fool's game. As I said, there are these three dynamics of tariffs that we're dealing with: steel and aluminum, the so-called fentanyl tariffs, and the 10% global tariffs, as well as the, you know, the reciprocal things that he talks about. And then there's the whole issue of Kuzma, or the renegotiations that have to come up in calendar 2026 for ratification at some time in the future, probably with a Democratic-controlled Senate, or House rather, and probably with a Republican-controlled Senate, one presumes, based on contemporary polls. So that the whole world is going to change in the next while. So I think anybody who thinks that it would be wise for Prime Minister Carney or the government to rush in or to make assumptions in the first eighth of the second term of the Trump administration, and for any of that to hold through the political storms and challenges that are in front of us, I think is playing a fool's game. The responsible thing to do is to play the long game, is to recognize that Canadians have no fight with Americans. We want to do business and continue to cheer for each each other's athletes and support each other's economies and do business and have our families, vacationing and enjoying each other's company. And Americans have the same view of Canadians. That's the relationship. It's the long game, and that will be rebuilt brick by brick because it has not been destroyed by one president or one sweep of tariffs.
But Jonathan, Louis Blouin was here earlier, and he's heard, similar to what I have heard, that if there isn't a deal struck in this window leading up to the G7, it could go on. It could really drag. And you're going to see those third quarter economic numbers kick in the United States where the pain of the tariffs will be felt. That will be Trump's problem. He can't blame that on Joe Biden, right? But it means those numbers and those industries, it's going to be a tough slog.
He will still blame Joe Biden, but
yes, he will.
Let him do that.
Yep.
I think I agree with James that being thoughtful, taking time to make the right decision at the right moment. Again, I don't think our expectation is that by the G7, next 9 to 10 days, everything is going to be solved, but we may be in a better place. And imposing counter tariffs in those 10 days will not help Canadian industry, help Canadian workers, those who are affected, as much as hoping to get past this next little bit of time and see where we can get. I don't think that Liberal governments under Trudeau or Carney in the last 5 months have shown an uneasiness in applying reciprocal tariffs or counter tariffs and being targeted, making sure that they're punitive enough on industries that are going to really push back against Trump. And so he feels it domestically and he hears the complaints. That's the way to approach it. That's the way they've done it until now. And I think that they're continuing down that path. I think at some point there will be, if there's no short-term deal where some of it is lessened, I think there will be a Canadian response. There'll have to be. But this, I understand that the Conservatives, the opposition, that's their job is to oppose, but I'm not sure they're scoring many points right now. People understand that immediacy is not a solution.
Right. Can I just say, sorry, I don't mean to take time from others, but there's nothing special about the G7 summit other than it's a media moment and an opportunity to do something. But there's nothing about that should box in the Prime Minister, number one. Two is, as I said, we have these three dynamics of tariffs that are in front of us, plus the CUSMA agreement. With any negotiation, Canada, we do have some puts and takes that we can have with regard to negotiations. Because we are facing pressures on steel and on aluminum and on autos, and because there are industries that are really hurting acutely right now, the puts and takes and some of the compromises we might be prepared to do in order to settle that dynamic, those might be some of the things that we want to hold on to, lest we have to give more in a future CUSMA negotiation. Right. So it's a lot for the government to balance here, the needs for the tariff dynamics in these three phases, but also have to recognize that there's going to be an expectation for perhaps some give on a CUSMA agreement in the coming couple of years. So the government should go slow.
Yeah, look,
be very judicious about what's in front of us.
Yeah, and certainly wasn't trying to leave the impression that the G7 summit is a do or die here, but it is the next time the two leaders are together, and Trump being kind of transactional, the CEO to CEO thing, I think that's kind of what they were looking at as a window for progress or movement. Andrew, your thoughts on the pace of the response? I mean, go slow and stay calm. Is that your advice as well?
Well, I think that is where they're going, but probably for a somewhat different reason than what we've been talking about. The objective, I don't think, is any longer to get us back to where we were. I think that it's now very firmly believed in Ottawa and Queen's Park and other places that we are now moving the economy into a point of transition, and they are starting to think about the what next. What goes beyond where we've been for the last 30 or 40 years with the auto sector? What does our advanced manufacturing sector look like? Those are the questions that are going to take a bit more time to work through, and I think that's why you're seeing the federal decision making go slowly as it is, both in terms of what they're building in their budgets, whenever that appears, their spending plans, what they're doing in terms of the trade pieces. But this idea that somehow this is, and I think we had this under Trudeau, that this was all just going to get recentered, we get things settled back down, make a few tweaks to CUSMA and off we'd go. I think this government, the Carney government, is looking at much more fundamental restructuring, and I think, frankly, Ford has bought into that as well, that something else bigger is going to happen here, because in part, we can't trust the partners that we have had down south. We've got to actually figure out what we're going to do going forward.
Shashi, what's your sense of the appetite for the go slow approach, right? Because the election was the elbows up, hit back, the dollar for dollar tariffs. You're going to run out of economy in a certain amount of time, and they did kind of around the 15th, 16th of April, right, when there was a remission put in place on a bunch of the tariffs. What's the appetite to go slow and kind of push through the pain?
Well, everything can be, looked at through that lens of elbows up. You talk about pain. What is actually the pain threshold? What is the pain threshold for Canadian households? What is the pain threshold for families that are expecting and bracing for loss of work, loss of income in the sectors that are going to be on the front line of these tariffs and are already on the front line of the tariff impacts, but also all of the secondary, tertiary, and ripple effects through the Canadian economy in terms of the impact on workers. Now, I would say that through the lens of elbows up, I do think Canadians are prepared to eat something of a bruised sandwich to an extent. But that is not something that can continue indefinitely. It is not something that can continue in a worsening or a degrading situation that gets worse and worse and worse over time. But this is where, when to communicate, when not to communicate. It makes sense to be tight-lipped on the substance of what's being discussed. But, Justin Trudeau, for all his many faults, did do one pretty smart thing in times of crisis, which was come out occasionally and say, hey, look, we've got your backs. And, it just gave the country a hug. It made them feel better. It reminded them of their resolve. It reminded them of what the greater issue was for everyone. And, occasionally I think we're going to have to figure out who the consoler-in-chief is going to be in this government. It may not be Mark Carney. It may be somebody in his cabinet. I don't know who the best communicator is out there at this stage, and it may well be the Prime Minister. But the point being that Canadians are prepared to put up with this to a point. I don't know exactly where that wall breaks, but they need to be reminded of right. What's at stake here.
But, James, in the macro, I would agree with Shachi, but like in the micro, it starts to get pretty tough, right? We talked to Matthew Shoemaker, the mayor of Sault Ste. Marie, where Algoma, more than half of its steel goes into the U.S. and it says 50% tariff makes it essentially unviable. I'm sure it's a similar story in Hamilton. It's not going to be long before those industries start to get into crisis points and pivoting your procurement to buy Canadian steel, for example, or build big defense projects. It's not going to happen in the time frame that they need it to happen in, right?
Yeah, and so then tools need to be put on the table, everything from, EI to worker support to fast tracking. You can stockpile some capacity for building future infrastructure projects. We do have maintenance that we have to do at our ports, at our rail yards that are government owned, our border crossings. There are things that the government can do to do those kind of things. They're sort of pre-sales and so on for things that we need to do for maintenance and so on. So, if there's no easy answer is the reality of things. So it's going to be a real challenge, and those folks are going to be hurt for quite some time because the belligerence of the president is sort of unabating at this point.
So, Jono, how do you do negotiation management, trade management, and parliamentary management, and political management? With all of that kind of coming together, because the political pain is going to start to be real if there isn't meaningful progress, and you do start to see the deep economic scarring.
And what are we, 4.5 weeks in since cabinet was sworn in? A lot has been done in that short time. But yeah, I think we're in a bit of a honeymoon. To Shachi's point, what's people's tolerance for pain? I think it's pretty short. I don't think it's as short as, some people who are just attacking the government left and right, expecting miracles. But yeah, James was suggesting a few, ideas that I think are good in terms of some Band-Aid solution short term. There is no macro solution to all of this. I think you're going to have to see some more general supports being considered. Those may be into the fall, and that's the question is how much longer do we have where they're going to cut taxes and do a few measures in the short term? What are those medium-term measures going to look like? I hope, and I don't think that they're being overly optimistic that by the G7 this is all going to be solved. So the question is what are those next steps? How do they figure out where the biggest pressure points are, where people are feeling it the most? Right. There's been a lot of questions. We've discussed it on these panels about a budget or not. That's one of the big questions is we don't know where those supports are most needed, and it may take a couple of months to really figure that out.
Yeah, and look, just so people at home don't get lost in what the president is doing, because it's a lot. What we're talking about maybe getting resolved by the G7 is the sectoral tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs, and those things. It's not the broader renegotiation of the trade agreement. That's a whole other process. Mexico wants to start that in September. Canada says not until 2026. But Andrew, as these weeks and months go by, from summit to reappraisal of things, the financial toll is going to keep adding up, right? And Mark Carney's going to go to these summits in Europe where they're going to make big defense commitments to NATO and in this Build Europe partnership. The bottom line of this government could really take a different turn if there is no agreement with the U.S. and could get a whole lot better if there is some kind of a peace talk that works with Donald Trump.
It's likely there'll be something that'll happen, because the piece we're not talking about is how much pain the Americans are in right now, which is significant. And I think that they really are looking at this as it's all self-directed pain with no gain. And there's no obvious upside for them. There's this promise of new factories somewhere down the road, but nobody's seeing it. And at the same time, prices are getting worse. The uncertainty in terms of what their entitlements are with the budget bills are getting worse. So, I mean, it's a very unstable situation down there. And I think there is a real bigger question about who blinks first. The other piece, though, here, and I think this is where we're missing the point of what's really at stake, and that is the question of how do you get these industries to make the investments to do what needs to be done next. Algoma Steel is a great example of this. They had recently talked about how likely, because of the disruption in the steel sector, they would need to move away from making coil and start to making sheets. Part of that was they'd need to change their furnace system to move to an arc furnace. That's a massive investment. It will result, obviously, in some kind of layoff of staff while they do it. But that's the type of investment that the business needs to make to become competitive after whatever happens in the cycle. So what people have got, and I think what Carney is trying to figure out, and this government, is how do you convince the business community that we are in fact moving forward? We are not just going to get back to what we were. The new money is going to have to flow in from the business community to retool. Certainly the government's going to have to step up with new money to support workers and families, but that will be the transition period to something else. If there continues to be this belief that we're just going to snap back to where we were 6 months ago, that investment won't happen.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really what the problem is, and I think that's where Carney's really trying to push things forward.
No, I think you're right. It'd be folly to think you're going back there, because 6 months from now it could all be upended again. Shachi, a quick last word to you, and then we've got to say goodbye.
I mean, I would just say that the task ahead is gargantuan and daunting, and you really feel like you got to feel for anybody in this situation, the harassed mom of the household who is trying to deal with meal planning and the kids' long-term futures and what's going on with the value of the house and should we get a dog or not. I don't mean to trivialize it, but there's just everything at this moment is urgent and important. The to-do list is massive, and I think from that perspective, Canadians do have some months of tolerance and patience in them to see where this goes. But the communication and the forward communication on this is going to be critical.
Okay, we got to leave it there. I want to thank you all. I appreciated the comments today. Jonathan Kalis, James Moore, Andrew Thompson, and Shachi Curl.